And welcome back. So we got those two bolts installed onto that passenger cylinder head again for the rear bracket and for that front bracket. And as I was looking over things, with the wiring harness still relatively easy to move around because it hasn't been really locked, locked into place yet. I'm going to go ahead and see about getting the passenger side valve cover installed, because it would be easier to kind of get this valve cover in there while we have a little bit of movement inside of that wiring harness. So again, what you were seeing, and you probably have seen this and shot in a couple of the other videos, is that we went through and cleaned these up, degreased them, and shot them with some hemi orange from Duplicolor. And that is the number right there, DHE 1652. And some of you may like it, some of you may hate it. The reason why that we did this was just to kind of reflect a little bit on the fact that it now has a Hellcat oil pump, the same lifters a Hellcat would use, and some hardened push rods. I mean, just to kind of make it noticeable, as if the supercharger, isn't enough notice, but just to kind of make it noticeable to anybody who may be servicing this equipment or this engine, that there's been some modifications done to it. So the reason why we went with orange was that we also own a Hellcat here on this channel, and I own a 6-speed manual, meaning that the valve covers in that case on that Hellcat are painted orange. If I remember correctly, the Demons are black and the Red Eyes are painted red. So we went with orange in this case to kind of reflect the version of Hellcat that we also have on this channel. So what I'm going to do next is just go ahead and peel off this masking tape. We did go ahead and remove the old valve cover seals. And we're going to go through and put new spark plug well seals on the underside and put a new seal around the lip. Now, what I did here, just to kind of show this to you, I took a little bit of masking tape and kind of tapped it around the edges of these mounting studs where the bolts go through for the coils, for the spark plug coils, and kind of painted over it. Now we should be able to now then just kind of peel these up, and there you go. These are nice unpainted exposed surface. And again, how we did that was I just took a piece of painter's tape, put it over here, took the edge of a small hammer and tapped around the edge of it. And what that will get it to do is the edge of this stud will kind of tear through the tape, allowing you to make a nice, perfect circle of tape, so you can kind of get everything else painted except for the very top of that. Because again, it's a threaded insert, brass threaded insert from the looks of it, and I didn't want to get any paint down in it. But you can see the end result is you can just scrape these once your paint's dry, peel them off, and you end up with some nice unpainted spaces. So I'm going to do that to all of this. There we go. So you can kind of see how, again, we just laid out several strips flat just to kind of cover up this surface, because again, this flat surface that you see here on these valve covers isn't your sealing surface. Your sealing surface, much like the timing cover, comes from the gasket that we're going to press in place, because it's a raised gasket, and it'll kind of squish in place when you tighten up the valve cover. And the seals for this did come in the upper engine seal kit. The spark plug well seals are these peanut looking things, and they're inside of the bag along with your intake seals. And let me go grab the seal for the actual outside cover itself. And these are the seals for the valve covers themselves. Just you know, get them in, line up the pattern, and you should be good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and take care of that, and then I'll bring you back and I'm going to show you that all we're going to be doing on this, it's not really much entertainment to watch, it's just getting this seal for instance right there. Just kind of follow the groove, get it lined up in little divots where they need to be lined up, and then I'll go through and kind of press this in place, and then we should be good. But I'm going to go ahead and take care of that off camera, and then I'll bring you back. Catch you in a bit. So I wanted to show you this. You can see these peanut seals. You can see how it kind of has a lip on the edge of that seal, and this side is pointed and this side's a bit more flat, and so that's the side that faces up. So I just want to bring you back and show you that. So when we go to reinstall these, we're going to reinstall these in the same order. Again, you'll kind of see that lip on that one. That one's a bit more of a pointed end, this one's a bit more of a flat end, and this is exactly the way we took them out. So this is the way we'll install the new ones. So I'll bring you back in a bit. Also the same with this valve cover gasket itself. You can kind of see where one end of this is a little bit of a wedge, kind of a point, and the other side of this has that same lip. So it looks like it's going to press down with this pointed end in towards the groove and come out with this wider, flatter area, which makes up your sealing surface. So it looks like, let's just see if we can get this to line up here. So what I'm going to do is just kind of loosely start in one of these corners and continue to work my way around. Let's see. I'll tell you what, let me try this the other way. It doesn't look like this is asymmetrical in any way. Let's see. Hopefully you can see that, but again, I'm just kind of loosely following the groove, and the format of this, obviously, just kind of getting all these indentations you see here and just following this channel, just to kind of loosely get everything in place. You can see we got a little bit of excess gasket there. Let's do this. Let's get this in here because we know this is where it needs to be. Try one thing. Okay. I'm going to grab the other seal and see if it does the same thing. This one seems to be going a lot better. So these may be cover specific. Yeah, this one's not giving me that deal where it was getting excessively long at one point and not lining up to the next little horseshoe shaped piece to the bolt there. There we go. Okay, so as you can see there, that gasket fit a lot better onto that cover. Just grab the other one, and I just kind of went around the edges, working my way through it, making sure that it followed the contour. So one thing about this passenger side cover, which is why I'm electing to go ahead and put it on now, is that you have to fight this cover around the lines that are coming up for the fuel and the purge solenoid and such, and I'll show that to you. So the far corner of this, you can potentially grab this seal and kind of roll it out of this lip, and that's what you want to avoid doing. So which is why I want to put this on, so we're not fighting the wiring loom on top of everything else trying to get this to seat in place. Okay, so it looks like we've got this good and inside this channel. At this point, we got our spark plug gaskets, or spark plug well gaskets, all replaced. We got this gasket in there. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go ahead and cut the camera, and then I'll bring you back to show you how we're going to wrestle this in there. And I've already got our bag. It's labeled our valve cover bolts for our passenger side. So I'm going to get you set up in a different tripod, and I'll bring you back. And welcome back. So we got you on the tripod looking at the passenger side cylinder head, and as you can see, let me just pan you up here for a second. You've got a lot of I don't want to say debris, but you got a lot of stuff in that upper corner that you have to clear to get that cover on. Obviously, one of them being the rocker arms themselves for the valves, the other one being the wiring harness, and obviously the last one being, as you can see it there, all those fuel line, vacuum line, wiring harness and stuff that comes up off that back bracket and kind of comes up and curves around that passenger upper corner is what you're going to be fighting to get that in there. So the reason why I want to do this, and you can see me kind of push this wiring harness out of the way, is that with that wiring harness not really being fixed to much right now, it's easier to at least get that out of the way so we don't have to deal with it, so we're not fighting with it, and give us a better chance of getting that valve cover on without rolling over that upper corner seal. So once we get the valve cover to seat, you can just kind of take your finger and up around that upper corner and just kind of press down on that seal and just make sure that it doesn't roll out of position on you. Otherwise, you know, that's going to account for an oil leak. So I'm going to go ahead and pause you so I can get up in there and kind of get situated to see if we can get this in place. And the valve cover bolts are 8mm. So I'm just going to get those in. I'm going to hand tighten them for now. We'll come back and torque everything down once we're ready. But before we do that, before I put this cover in place, I'm just going to grab an oiling can and I'm going to thoroughly bathe the rocker arms, the springs, a lot of the assembly that you see in here, just to make sure that at least everything has at least a light to medium coat of oil before we put that valve cover in place, just so things don't start, you know, completely dry. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and take care of the oiling. Then I'm going to get myself situated, and we'll bring you back, and we'll see if we can get a shot of doing this live. We may or may not succeed, but we'll give it a shot. Talk to you in a bit. And welcome back. Let's see here. So I've got everything kind of squirted down with a little bit of oil, mainly focused on the areas right here that actuate on the rocker arms themselves, a little bit on top of each spring, and you can kind of see a little bit of a sheen of oil that's pulled up in various spots in the bottom of the cylinder head. So what I'm going to do is attempt to just kind of keep this wiring harness out of the way. There we go. All we got to do now is navigate around everything here in the corner and try not to catch and roll or seal. Just grabbing the valve cover now, just making sure that this gasket is pressed in place. feels like it is. And I just saw something that I need to get out of this cover. Looks like a residual part of a Christmas tree clip I need to get out of this bottom piece. Okay, let me pause the camera and I'll bring right back. And welcome back. We've got that little bit of Christmas tree clip removed, and what it was just one of those pieces left over from one of the Christmas tree clips that we broke when we did the disassembly, and it was easier to dig it out from the underside of it versus trying to get it out through the top. So that's why I want to go ahead and take that out. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just making sure that this gasket is seated, and it feels like it is. And what we have to do is get it around all of this, and let's get our wiring pigtail out of our way there. We kind of have to, it looks like, pick up just a little bit on these hoses over here. There we go. And as you can see, that did set down in place. That looks good. And in case you're wondering, yes, these are, you can put these on backwards, meaning flipping this around the other direction and fitting this in. But you'll notice that your spark plug wells in your valve cover do not line up with the head, even though all the bolt holes will line up. So, case in point, in case you put one on and you notice your holes are shifted off to the side a little bit, don't panic. Just take it off, flip it around the other direction, and put it back on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to see if I can get into the back of here and just make sure that I didn't roll that seal on that corner, getting it around all of this, and that feels good. I can just kind of grab the top corner of that gasket. I'm going to grab the bottom corner of this just to also make sure that it didn't roll. Yep. And that feels good. And like I said, getting to this top one, as you can see, is a pain in the rear because of just the way they just happen to route all of this plumbing over here. Okay, that feels good. That corner feels good. Okay, so it doesn't feel like we rolled our gasket any. I'm going to go ahead and get a couple of fasteners into this. Again, just to hold it. And then I'll bring you back. So just want to add another item into this. Excuse me. You'll notice that because we painted it, we did take the bolts out of the cover, which does make it easier to kind of finagle that in place because you're not dealing with, bolts hanging down over the edge of the cover. And as you saw in a previous video, how easy it is to remove those. They just kind of pop out. And the reverse is the same. What I'm doing to put these back in is I'm just taking the bolt and pulling it all the way to the back, and they're captive. The bolts won't come completely out of these bushings, or at least they won't on this one. So I'm pulling that back to take the thread so the bolt length isn't sticking through the bottom, and then taking them like this, and you'll feel them when they seat. Just give them a bit of a push and they will pop into place like that one did there. You'll feel it seat. And then you can just kind of hand tighten the bolt in place. So that may be something that you can try if you're having difficulty getting this valve cover to line back up again. Is just go ahead and just quickly pop those bolts out, get your cover in, and then pop your grommets back in. I'm going to go ahead and finish working my way around this, and we'll bring you back. Thank you. And welcome back. So what you can see here, you can see our driver's side valve cover. We did get our passenger valve cover installed that you saw in the previous clip. Same process. We did mask it off and tape it. We pulled out the little peanut-shaped spark plug well seals. And we're going to go ahead and replace those. Again, It does come with the upper engine seal kit. We should have 4 left in this bag. And we do. Got it. Same process as before. Again, you'll see a lip on that one and kind of a point edge on that one. So they're going to go like this. So flat part up and that upper seal up. Or I should say edge lip up. These are relatively straightforward to put in. Just get them started and send them the rest of the way home. Okay. Got our spark plug well seals in. Gonna grab our other valve cover gasket. So once again, to show that to you, is that you're gonna see a lip, again, just like we saw before, kind of a lip on that end and kind of a pointed end on that end. So it looks like this end is going to go down inside of our channel, that pointed end. I'm just going to start on one of the corners here, kind of get it lined up and just follow the channel one direction all the way around. Let it decide when it's happy to be lined up. Let me flip. I'm going to flip this the other direction. Just go in end for end. As you can see that we had one area there where we had some excess gasket. So let's try this with the other way around. Okay, so that's better. Just going to work on getting it into that edge. Okay, it's about there. I'm going to go ahead and finish this up, and I'll bring you back. One moment. Okay, so yeah, it was fighting me there in the corner in a little bit, so what I ended up doing was just standing it on its edge so I can kind of navigate this corner. And then once I got it to finally fall into place into that groove, that the excess slack we were working with kind of all the way around kind of took itself up. Okay, so that looks good. That looks all nice and pressed in place at this point. Okay, yep. All right, so what I'm going to do is you'll notice that we also, before, when we uninstalled it and before we painted it, we just wrote a D for driver's side, and we also wrote stud, which means this one had a rather unique fastener for the valve covers. And it would have been, once I find it, because I just had it, there it is. It's that one right there. So it's and again, it's another one of their double-sided fasteners. So we had something that was attached into, or using that as an additional mounting point. So when we go to reassemble it, we know that this stud needs to go in this corner. Now, since we've got more room to deal with on this driver's side, I'm going to go ahead and pop these back in place. So we're not doing it while it's on the vehicle. But just to show you that, kind of like we saw earlier, you can just take these. Let me show you on this one. Take them, push them a little bit, and you'll kind of hear that just click in place. And again, those bolts are captive, so they're pretty easy to get out and pretty easy to get back in case you need to replace them. But again, we removed them when we painted it. But since we've got more room to deal with on the driver's side, we're going to go ahead and put all these in. We'll get you set up on the tripod, and we'll show you that we should be able to do the driver's side of this without having to take these out for the extra clearance. And I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we'll bring you back. Thank you. And welcome back. So just as before, we went ahead and took our oiling can real quick and just kind of doused down all the pivot points of our rocker assemblies, or rocker arm assemblies, just kind of like that, or just around the edges. Now, yeah, granted, most of that's going to kind of run off and eventually make it its way down to the oil pan or find another place to live. At least it'll keep it from, you know, starting up completely dry. And, you know, we'll also do a couple things before we allow it to start. We'll go ahead and pull the fuel pump fuse out, crank it over a bunch until we see oil pressure build before we actually let it start. But again, this is just giving it some little extra protection. Now, if you remember, when we put our bolts back inside of our valve cover, one of them was a studded bolt. So, and if I remember correctly, I believe the studded one was up over here in this corner, but we'll find out because like I talked about on the passenger side one there, the cover can go on the other way and the bolt holes will line up, but the socket wells won't. So that'll tell us pretty quick how close, you know, pretty definitively whether we have the cover on the right direction. Again, I believe that stud went over here. I just wiping some oil up off of that that mating surface that dripped down from when I oiled things earlier. Okay, let's see if we can get this. Okay. So it looks like the easiest thing to do is going to be go in from the back here, come in underneath all this hardware, and hopefully just drop it in place. And there we go. So you can see the driver's side one is much easier to do versus the passenger. And you can see that our spark plug well holes, you may not be able to see it that good from the angle, but it does line up with our
spark plug well holes in the valve cover versus the cylinder head. And just to show you, because you might want to see it, if you were to take this out and just rotate it, thinking that, you know, you've got it in there. Pardon me, I have to kind of get this around 180 degrees here. There we go. You'll see that it'll go in and the bolt holes will bolt up, will kind of match up. Oh, hold on, I'm not quite where it needs to be. There we go. The bolt holes will match up, but your holes in your cylinder head will be off. So that's a pretty good indication that you got it on the wrong way around. So again, we're just going to take that back off. Check my seal underneath to make sure I didn't roll it out of position. Yeah, I got one spot here. It looks like it rolled out of the groove a little bit. There we go. So there's going to be, the driver's side isn't too bad about doing it, but as you saw on the passenger side, you just got to make sure that when you're putting this in, that if it catches on any of that hardware that makes up that cylinder head, that you just check that gasket to make sure you didn't roll it. So again, you can see me, it looks the easier just to kind of come in at an angle like this, get it underneath those air conditioning pipes, try to avoid smacking into those rocker arms, and just set it down into position. And there we go. Now we can kind of just get things back on hand tight. Oh, sorry, I hit the light with my arm and turned it off. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to follow the torque sequence. I'm not going to torque them yet, but I will hand snug them. In case you're curious, that's the torque pattern. So I'm going to follow that. I'm going to get everything hand tight down, and then I'll bring you back for the next piece. Thank you much. And welcome back. As you can see, let me try to put a little bit more light on. My shop light's almost dead. We've got our valve cover in at least hand tight, and we followed the same torque sequence that we did on the passenger side. In an instance of full disclosure, I did have to thread chase one of the valve cover bolts into the cylinder head. That was that center one here. It was going in kind of weird and not correct, and started to tighten up on me. So I immediately pulled it out, pulled the cover off, and ran a thread chaser through it, and was able to clean the threads up and remedy the issue. Just got a little bit of gunk inside of the threads. But I guess let that be an important footnote, is that those valve cover bolts should thread in pretty effortlessly. And if you have one giving you trouble, or if it feels a little bit tight, like it's kind of not going in correct, stop what you're doing, back up, try it again. If it still gives you a fit, then by all means pull it out, get yourself a thread chaser, and go through it. And the thread chaser in my kit that fit the size of it was called it was an M6 that fit the threads of the bolts for that cover. Again, once we ran a thread chaser through it, the bolt then went in like butter with no further issue. So we got everything hand tightened down on both sides. We'll come back and we'll torque it here. It's kind of probably one of our last steps, just like we did on the passenger side here. I'm going to get some shop towels and just kind of put them down a little bit into the open cylinder wells there, just to keep any debris from falling inside the combustion chamber while we're continuing to work. But when I bring you back, the next thing that we're going to look into doing is just doing a little bit of cleanup on this front timing cover area where the water pump bolts, and then we'll see about at least getting the water pump installed and getting it torqued down, and then we'll move on from there. And like I said, I'll bring you back in a bit. Thank you much. Bye. And welcome back. You may remember this from a previous video when we took the water pump out, but we made ourselves a cardboard template to remind us what bolts went into what locations. Because as you can probably see from the bottom there,
They are different links in different spots, so it is imperative that they go back in place where they were taken out of. And what I want to show you here is that per the manual, that's the torque sequence for those bolts. Those bolts, per also, again, all data. The water pump for a 6.4, looks like they're calling for 21 foot-pounds on those bolts. So we went ahead and cleaned up our mating surface here a little bit. It wasn't too terrible. And I didn't get every little speck of crud off of this because, again, the water pump, much like the valve covers and the timing cover, have a gasket that extends out. And that lip that extends out is actually where you get your seal. So I went over it a little bit with some red Scotch-Brite in a couple areas, and then just went over it 3 or 4 times with a clean shop towel. And I'll do it one more time before we mate it, just to clean off any excess oils and things of that nature. And then we'll go ahead and get this bolted up. But to show you that water pump, and we are putting a new water pump in, because no better time to do it. Might as well do it while we're here. You can see that the water pump, as we were looking at earlier in one of the very earlier videos when we were going over our parts, it does come with the gasket already installed for you. Just to show you the front of this again, it did come with this sensor pre-installed, and we will be installing a new thermostat onto this housing as well. Now, in this particular case, you can see that the water pump housing is also the mounting location for the Serpentine belt tensioner. So I'm going to work on that. I'm going to work on getting this onto the engine block, and we'll get this all torqued up, and we'll move on to the next piece. I'm probably not going to film it because it's not very interesting. It's literally just putting this in place, putting the bolts in, and kind of getting everything torqued down. But I will do that, and I will bring you back for the next piece. Thank you much. And welcome back. So you can see in our template, all of our bolts are going at this point. If we look back at our water pump, see if I can get you in there for a closer look. We've got everything torqued, and as we were torquing it per our fashion, we just went through and hit all the bolt heads with a green Sharpie. Again, to verify as we were setting our final torque that we touched all of our fasteners. I did go around and set the final torque 3 times, so I repeated their torque sequence 3 times to verify that everything was seated that needed to be seated. As you can see, we went ahead and installed our new thermostat and torqued those bolts as well. Those were 22 foot-pounds. For the water pump, it wants them at 21, and for the thermostat housing, 22. Not sure why, but again, I'm going off the all data, so those specs could be a bit off. But we torqued those thermostat housing bolts at 22 per the documentation we have, and as you can see, marked those bolts in green as well. We loosely installed the bracket that was bolted in this position, because I think the bracket went like that because it has a cooling line that comes over here and plugs into this port here. If I remember correctly, that's where it sits. If not, it's easy enough just to take it off and rotate it around. So that's why we just have it loosely installed, so we don't lose track of that nut or that bracket. Also, in our cardboard template, we had this bolt right here, which I've just loosely threaded in place just to, again, hold on to it. That is the hold down bolt for the Egr cooling tube that comes over and stakes down in the top of the water pump that you see here. So when we do the Egr cooler, which we're getting ready to do here in a few minutes, that will sit in the center of the engine below the intake in that valley right there. It has 2 cooling lines. Again, one that comes over, has kind of a 90-degree bend, plugs in the top of the oil pump, and the other one goes in the back of the timing cover. If you look at the previous video when we were first putting the timing cover on, I pulled the old cooling tube out of a passage, out of a port back here, and it has an associate hold down bolt. And I'll show you that when we get to that point. But I think what we're going to do next is we're going to get the Egr gaskets together that we need, and we're going to go ahead and at least put the cooler
at least the body of the cooler, and then attach it to the driver's side exhaust manifold. And by attach, I mean I'm going to put the seal in place, and I'll show you this, but I'm going to put the seal in place. We're going to put the tube in place, but I'm not going to put the fastening hardware in there because, again, those exhaust pipes below haven't been bolted up to the collectors on the cylinder heads, and I don't want to drop another bolt down there and, you know, turn into another couple-hour fiasco trying to fish that thing back out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here and I'm going to grab a couple things. We've got our one of our Egr coolant tubes is there. We've got some gaskets here. This is the gasket that goes on the driver's side exhaust manifold that the Egr pipe then slides over those two studs. And that is the part number for that one. Yeah. This is one of the two Egr coolant tubes. And that's the part number for that one. This is the one that plugs into the back of the timing cover, seats in place, and then this open end that you see here goes on to the Egr cooler. I'm going to grab the other Egr coolant hose because we did replace them both. I'm going to finish getting these cut off, but what we need next is this big old heavy piece. Well, it's not too heavy, it's just awkward more than anything else. You can see there, yeah, it looks like it's got a flex joint there in the center as well. So this is the part that bolts onto the driver's side exhaust manifold. That we'll put a gasket on, we'll slip this over the studs, but we're not going to tighten it. We're going to leave it well enough alone. Then once we get the collector underneath bolted on the exhaust manifold and we're not fearful of dropping the nut down the exhaust again, then we'll go ahead and get these fasteners attached. I'm going to go ahead and finish cutting the rest of these hoses off so that way we can get this mounted back down in the center valley of that motor. And I've also got new gaskets for all of this as well. So there's a new gasket to put here as well as the other Egr accessories. This is part of the Egr pipe that goes into the Egr valve. And then there's another Egr piece here, another Egr pipe here with its hardware. And this is the piece that goes into the intake. So we won't be ready to bolt this one back on until we have the intake in place. But we might be able to take it as far as at least getting this piece in, our valve put back in, and then this piece here, which kind of sits and connects from the Egr cooler that you see here, kind of sits in like that, comes out to the front of the timing cover, and then the Egr valve bolts to the front of the timing cover with a gasket making with a mate for that surface. And then the output of the Egr valve comes out of this end here via this tube and then goes into the port on the intake. Which I've got the intake here. Let me see if I can show you where that's at, because it's kind of on the side. There you go, right there. Okay, awesome. So let me go ahead and get things prepped, get this in place, grab the hardware, get this ready to go, and then I'll bring you back. Thank you. And welcome back. So what you're seeing is the driver's side exhaust manifold bolted to the head, but you'll see those two studs where that Egr cooler pipe meets the exhaust manifold. And this is that Egr Flange Gasket, if you want to call it that, or just Egr gasket. It's just multi-layer steel. Now it's got like a beveled edge on it, so you can see where that's indented and that's raised. I can't really find a description for it in the book as to whether it goes on like that or goes on like that. In other words, raised side up or down. I'm going to put the raised side up. And that way, when the Egr pipe bolts down in it,
it presses up against that ridge and helps make it seal. Yeah, because both sides are flat. Yeah, there's not like an indentation or a ridge on it. So that's the way I'm going to do it. Like I said, I don't see anything in the book that covers it and says anything different. So that's the way I'm going to go with it. And obviously, if it causes a problem, I'll let you know. But that's the way I'm going to do it. You can kind of see that raised edge pointing up. And it just slips over those two mounting studs. Probably it's going to be terrible for you to try to see this. There we go. There you go. Hopefully you get a good view of it there. And then what we're going to do next is snake that pipe in, EGR cooler pipe, from around and back of the head, the back of the driver's cylinder head, and we'll just kind of get it again just to sit on those two studs. And we'll get that done, and I'll bring you back. Thank you. Hopefully you can see that. We've got our EGR tube that goes to our EGR pipe that goes to our EGR cooler on those two mounting studs. And again, it'll just kind of sit that way until we get this exhaust bolted back up to that collector and lessening the fear of dropping a bolt down this exhaust pipe again. Then we'll go ahead and get that bolted up. But for now, that'll get it. But you can kind of see the way it wraps around that head. So when you're going to put that cooler back on, literally just take this piece, feed it into the top center of the engine, and just kind of gently guide it and twist it. And that pipe is pretty rigid, so it'll almost fall in place where it needs to be. Just leave it unbolted on top, come in below it, get it positioned on these studs, and then you can bolt the top piece. But let me grab my light here, and then I'll bring you back when we're back up to the top side view of this. One moment. And welcome back. As you can see, I've shoved a wad full of shop towels into the exhaust pipe here because I've kind of changed my mind. I think I'm going to bolt that into position, and the reasoning is when I go to torque the EGR cooler bolts that's in the center of that engine above, I don't want to pull it too far forward and get it to the point where you can't tighten this down later and it seats on that seal correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and put the bolts in on this one and get them snug, get them where they need to be, and then I'll go top side and finish torquing the mounting bolts down for the EGR cooler. So I've shoved a bunch of shop towels into the exhaust manifold or exhaust pipe you see here, just so that in case we do drop anything, it doesn't fall in. And we're just going to be real careful we don't drop a bolt. And as you can probably see, I did liberally coat those studs down with some anti-seize. So in the future, in case this has to be done again, hopefully those nuts will be a little bit easier to take off. So I'm going to go ahead and work on that, and then I'll bring you back when it's done. Thank you. Okay, we've got our bolts on our studs. We've got them tightened down. There is a torque spec, but however, trying to get a torque wrench on those, maybe you might be able to do it with a crow's foot, but that would suck. I mean, I put them down in there. I cinched them down by hand. I think it's good. I don't think it's going to leak. Obviously, I'll, get under here and check it. But we're good at this point. We got everything anti-seized up. We got it tight. So now we can go up top and complete our work there. And I'm going to go ahead and just take this wad of shop towel out so we don't forget about it. And I'll see you back up top. Catch you later. And welcome back. As you can see, we got our EGR cooler bolted down back to the engine block and torque per specifications. I believe it was 21 foot-pounds is what they were calling for on those particular bolts, and there's just the 3 you see there. So now we're up to the point of putting those EGR cooling tubes back on. Again, you've got 2 of them. This one, which goes from there
to the back of the timing cover, which intersects with the water pump. And you've got the second one, which goes to this tube here, comes over, gets secured into here, and then plugs into the top of the water pump here. So one thing you can do if these O-rings are being a bit of a pair, not bare, but bare, not pair, is you can put a little engine oil on them. I've done that before. You can also use a little bit of silicone paste. Don't go crazy. Rubber parts love silicone. So you can put a little bit of silicone paste around, just lightly coat that O-ring, and that should help it slide into position. Same thing with the hoses themselves. If these hoses are being a bit of a pain, and they're not wanting to slide easily onto those barbs, so you can then release this clamp holder that they have here, you can put a little bit of silicone on the inside of that hose, and that should help them seat right in place. I've done that before. Again, just don't go crazy with it and be globbing it in there. You need just very, very little. Now, when you order these hoses from the factory, like I did here, is what we were talking about earlier, you'll notice this clamp is glued in place at the bottom to hold it there so it didn't fall off in shipment. But the spring tension is being held open by this clip. So once you get this hose into position and get it where you need it, once you pull that clip off, then that clamp will slap shut and should help, actually not should help, but will help seal that connection. But just be careful with these because they do love to spring forward and catch you in the fingers. And trust me from experience when I tell you that if one of these things does spring forward and catch you in the finger, you're going to notice it. It's a little bit of a sting, let's put it that way. So I'm going to work on getting these the hoses in place. Once I get them in place, I'll bring you back and show you where they're seated. Talk to you in a bit. And welcome back. So I just wanted to show you here. That's that first hose for the EGR cooler assembly that we're putting in. That's the one that has that double-ended stud that we were looking at over when we were reviewing our bolts when we put the timing cover back on. And that just slides into place there. It's an O-ring fit. I put a little bit of silicone on it just to kind of help make sure that O-ring seats, and didn't roll on me. And then just re-secured it with its stud, because there is a wiring loom that will press in place on that if I remember correctly. So on the opposite end, what I did was I had a little pre-mounted cable clamp. I just went ahead and pressed that in place first, and then put that pipe where it needed to be. And now I'm going to go ahead and put the rear on. And I put a little bit of silicone in here. Again, just a very, very small amount. And we should be able to kind of pull this hose back, get it lined up on there, and you see how easy that hose went on. Almost literally no effort. Which again makes it nice. It also makes it really nice when you're doing the ones like back there with they go on the block heater, just to make sure that you don't push excessively on those and by chance damage something that you didn't mean to. So I'm gonna fiddle with that a bit, get that the rest of the way on there, and I'm gonna release that clamp and it should lock into place. I'm gonna do the same thing with the hose on the other side. Again, because it has an O-ring that goes into there, and then I'll bring you back when I get that done. Thank you. And welcome back. So you can see we've got our other EGR cooler pipe, which goes on the top of our water pump. And what I did on this one, just as maybe a little bit of a tip, is I left this mounting bolt loose at first, and then make sure I pushed in all the way to where that ridge you see on that fitting was flush with the top of the water pump, so there wasn't a gap. And then I tightened that bolt in place. So I wanted to make sure that that was completely seated. And then I took this hose and just worked it a little bit, and you can see there's a little bit of slack in it until I got the hose where I wanted it, and you can feel that that clamp is past the barb at the end, so it's good to tighten And the same thing with this one at the end. So they're both in good spots. We just have to release those clamps that are holding the spring tension open, and then we'll be good. Now the nice thing is, with having these pieces in here, we can start laying our wiring harness back into where it was originally. And the nice thing about wiring harnesses are, the longer they're in service, the more this becomes true. But they kind of have a memory effect. And by that is that after a few heat cycles and sitting in certain spots, they'll kind of lay in place to where they need to go. And by that, just to show you, is that this is the part of the wiring harness for the MDS solenoids. And if we look over here, if you remember, we have 3 studs on the tops of our cylinder, and I have 3 studs here that line up with that. So if you'll notice that as soon as I twisted that, that kind of lined up with that solenoid, that plug lined up with that solenoid, and it wraps around the engine. This plug lines up with that solenoid, and the rest of this harness, if you'll notice, you see that kind of just lays in there and wants the snake and make that 90-degree bend to get to that other solenoid underneath that. And you'll see that our cable clip there lines up with that stud, and it lines up with that stud. So if you remember, on this side we got a stud here and we have a stud here, and it lines up with our 2 ring terminals that push down over those studs. But you can kind of see the way these wiring harnesses, since they've been bent this way for so long, they kind of naturally kind of conform themselves to where they wanted to go. So it's just like another little breadcrumb thing that you can use in case you're having trouble figuring out, you know, where your wiring harnesses came off of. Now this wiring harness, before anyone says anything, yes, it needs to be fed underneath of this pipe, and don't worry, there's enough slack in there I can do that. And that's really the reason why I didn't put pressure, take that spring clip off yet. In case I need to back that hose off, I easily can, and just snake the wiring harness underneath. But talking about memory effect on wiring harnesses, if you'll notice here on the driver's side valve cover, where originally when we put it in, I put the stud up here in the top corner, and that was actually incorrect. If you look at our wiring harness down here, you'll see this little standoff, this little foot right there. That goes on that stud, and there's no way, you're going to go upside down, I apologize. There's no way that that stud, this wiring harness, is going to pick itself up high enough to have that stud sitting up here. But it does very comfortably sit down here. So that told me that stud, that double-ended stud, actually went on the bottom of the cylinder cover, not on the top. So I just went ahead and swapped those. Again, just a little tip. I hope that it helps you out. And what I'm going to do next is go ahead and start going through this and start laying our wiring harnesses out, replacing any of these type clips, just these little Christmas tree clips you see that we inadvertently broke. I did buy a package of them. All they are is just zip ties with the little Christmas tree clip on the end. I'll put a link in the Amazon description for that. And one final thing, and then we're going to call this a video. And then we'll bring you back when we start piecing more of this together. And when we do come back, it will more than likely be putting the power steering pump back in place, putting these 2 guide bolts on the air conditioning compressor down here, tightening those up and putting these back in place into the timing cover. If you remember, we had to double up the nuts on that and kind of use that to get those studs in. So we'll go ahead and get those studs tightened up. We'll put the power steering pump in and get that situated. and then we'll start prepping the rest of this wiring harness, getting the connectors where they need to be. We may concentrate, before we put the intake on, we may concentrate with putting all of the, actually no, strike that. We'll put the intake on first, and then we'll come back and finish routing the coolant hoses. Yeah, I think we'll do the coolant hoses as one of the last pieces. But I apologize. This has been a long video, but we got a lot accomplished today. We got our valve covers reinstalled. We got our water pump installed. We got our Egr cooler at least bolted to the block, and we have it partially installed. The rest will be finishing up the plumbing for that Egr. So we got that completed. Let's see. And the connection for the Egr cooler to the driver's side exhaust manifold has also been done. So we got a lot accomplished today, but we got a lot more to do. And then obviously I'll bring you back, and I'll talk to you later. Bye. And welcome back. If you remember in the previous video, we got our timing cover reinstalled that you can see here. We're going to continue on with buttoning up a couple of smaller items here. In our parts bag, we had a bag, as you can see, labeled here, passenger cylinder head, rear and front bracket bolts. And it's referring to these two here. This one here and this one here. This one goes in the rear of the passenger cylinder head, and it's a bolt that bolts the bracket for that. On the passenger side, if you remember, we loosened up the bracket that bolts into the bell housing, loosened it up to get a little bit of free play so we can get this passenger cylinder head reinstalled. And it has one bolt that bolts the top of the bracket to the rear of the cylinder head, and that's this one here. So we're going to go ahead and get that one installed. And again, that's that bracket that holds on to your fuel line, your purge solenoid line, and a couple of wiring harnesses come up on the passenger side and into a bracket that bolts the back of that cylinder head. So that's that one. We're going to get that one put back in place. And the front one here, and these are both 13 millimeter. This one goes here, and these are our transmission lines, if you remember. And there's our bracket for that. And that bracket just comes over here like this and bolts into this first bolt hole here. And as you can see, that threads in fine. So we're going to put that bracket back here, and on this hole here, remember that was just a Christmas tree clip hold down for a wiring loom that will get reinstalled. And I believe it was a wiring loom that I think had the, I think it was for the camshaft sensor, if I remember correctly, or it came up and plugged into our Egr solenoid, one of the two. But we'll get that taken care of when we cross to that bridge, because if you remember, that's going to require us to replace one of these types of hold downs here, which, you know, unfortunately their brittle plastic got broke during the deinstall. But I have a bag of these now, and we'll go ahead and get these replaced as we need. I'm going to go ahead and take care of that. I'll get those two bolts installed so we can go ahead and get that checked off the list, and then we'll continue on. More than likely it'll be the water pump next to get that out of the way, and then once the water pump is in, we'll start tackling the items that we need. We'll get our wiring harness put back in place for our MDS solenoids, and yes, we aren't going to be using those MDS solenoids. They're there just as basically placeholders at this point, but again, we'll go ahead and just reattach our wiring harness, get that laid back in place, and then we'll look into getting that Egr cooler reinstalled, because it does have one line that comes in the back of the timing cover, which is this port here that comes out and covers up by your watering pump. The other line comes over the top through here and pushes down into the top of that water pump. So that'll go ahead and take care of a couple of birds with one stone. so to speak. And well, we'll get to it. I'm going to get those 2 bolts installed, and we'll bring you back for the next piece. Talk to you in a bit.